The residents of Canton, Mississippi, already know to expect trouble whenever they see Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard. Driving around in a yellow truck with the Confederate flag in the windshield, their idea of fun is to terrorize and harass every black person in town. One afternoon, they cowardly attack a girl on her way home with groceries. Her name is Tonya Haley, and she is only 10 years old. The two men tie her up and take turns. Hours later, her brothers find the bag of groceries and tell their mother, Gwen. She calls her husband, Carl Lee, at work. When he gets home, Tonya has been found alive but terribly hurt. Lots of people from the community gather at their door when the ambulance arrives. Meanwhile, young lawyer Jake Briggins is talking to his secretary. Just like The Office, Ethel Whitty has been passed on to Jake by his mentor, Lucien Wilbanks. Unfortunately, though, it didn't come with the clientele, and Jake is still struggling to make ends meet. In another part of town, Sheriff Walls arrives at the bar where Billy Ray and Pete are drinking. He tells them that the little girl they have attacked did not die. She was able to provide a detailed description of them and of their infamous truck. Bad news travels fast, and Jake soon hears about the case. He's having lunch with his friend Harry Vonner when Deputy Looney tells them what happened. Jake knows the Haley family because he had defended Carl's brother once. Thinking of little Tonya, and being a father himself, he can barely believe such an atrocity. A few days later, Carl Lee comes to Jake's office in the afternoon. He asks about a recent crime where 4 white men had attacked a black girl. Jake confirms that they all walked and there was no justice for the victim. In a somber tone, Carl Lee says he might get in trouble soon. He wants to know if he can count on Jake. That night, Jake tells his wife Carla about that ominous visit. She says he should call Sheriff Walls and let him know about it. A man in that situation is capable of everything. It turns out she is right. Before their trial starts, when the two men are being escorted by Deputy Looney, Carl Lee Haley shows up with a gun and opens fire. Both defendants are killed, and Deputy Looney is badly injured. Not much later, Sheriff Walls and Deputy Tatum get to the Haleys to pick up Carl Lee. He is there with his family and offers no resistance. Jake sees him in jail. They talk about Deputy Looney, whose leg is not looking good. They also talk about that conversation they had before. Haley can't afford to pay the $50,000 it would normally cost, and Jake can't afford to take a very long and time-consuming case for much less. But they both know that, in this case, losing means the gas chamber. So when he's surrounded by reporters outside the building, Jake tells them that he is going to defend Carl Lee Haley. At the district office, DA Rufus Buckley is talking about this case and all the publicity involved. Brent Musgrove, one of the paralegals, says the defense attorney is Jake Briggins. Buckley is very happy to hear that, confident that his experience is more than enough to crush the newbie. He tells his team that the first thing to do is to keep the case in Canton, where there's a better chance of an all-white jury. Without the means to maintain a similar legal team, Briggins discusses the case with Lucien Wilbanks, his old mentor and once a respected lawyer. Lucien had his license revoked some time ago, for reasons we can see inside the glass he's holding. At Billy Ray's funeral, his brother Freddie is venting about Carl Lee Haley to a couple of friends. One of them is a man named Winston, and he says can help Billy Ray's family. He has a friend in the KKK and could give him a call. Freddie seems surprised that the organization still exists, but tells Winston to contact them and say they are needed in Canton now. At home, the Briggins family watches Jake's debut on TV. Carla says Sheriff Walls should have taken him seriously when he warned him about Carl Lee, but Jake doesn't really confirm that he ever made that call. The trial starts with Carl Lee pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution requests that their own doctors examine the defendant at some point. Judge Noose grants that and denies bail, as he usually does in murder cases. He also denies a change of venue even before the defense actually files the motion. However, a mysterious lady leaves a note to Briggins. After reading it, He reminds the judge that failure to consider a change of venue has twice before been grounds for reverting a decision on appeal. At the possibility of having his ruling later overturned, the judge tells Briggins he can submit the request after all. Buckley tells Musgrove to find State Dr. Rodeheaver and have him examine Haley. He also asks him to find out what Dr. Briggins will use so they can dig up enough dirt to get them discredited. At the county jail, Haley has bad news for his lawyer. Things have changed, and he can't pay as much as he had agreed to. No one will give him a loan now that he's in jail, and he lost his job at the mill. Jake explains he has bills to pay, but Haley has bills of his own, not to mention children to feed, and he wants to live. At night, that mysterious woman from the courthouse is waiting for Jake outside the office. Her name is Ellen Rourke, and her dad is a famous celebrity attorney. She's in law school now and wants to build her portfolio, so she's offering free work. Briggins politely declines, slightly offended at the assumption that he needs help. She dumps a few pages of precedents and similar cases on his lap and says he'll change his mind. Meanwhile, Freddie is now blindfolded in order to meet the Klan guy. They decide to start the Madison County Clavern, and the man says Freddie could be their leader. He also asks about Haley's lawyer and if he has a family. At Canton Memorial, Looney's family protests when they see Haley coming to visit. He ended up losing his right leg. Haley apologizes and says he never wanted to hurt him. At the same time, Freddie is proudly recruiting people to his clavern, and one of them is Deputy Hastings. On the next day, Jake's parents are with him at church. They are very worried about the case and the danger it involves. Jake even had his home number changed because of the death threats they were getting. On top of that, there are always dozens of reporters everywhere they go now, and Jake seems to be enjoying the fame more than the rest of his family. There's a commotion happening in another church in Canton. The Haley family arrives with Tanya, and the front row is cleared to make room for them. After the service, Reverend A.G. is approached by Isaiah Street and a group of people. They're with the NAACP, and they want to raise funds to hire someone else to defend Carl Lee. They think Jake Briggins might not fully understand the needs of the community. That same night, Carla gets a terrifying phone call. A man identifies himself as Mickey Mouse and tells her to leave the house immediately and take her daughter. She has barely put the phone down when Hannah starts screaming, and a horrific burning cross can be seen right outside. Sheriff Walls is thankful that Deputy Hastings was nearby, but that's because he doesn't know him like we do. After the cops are gone, it's time for Jake to face interrogation. Carla cries and complains about everything that's happening. For some reason, he thinks this is the perfect moment to tell her he never called the sheriff as she recommended before. She is obviously even angrier now, but he's saved by Hannah's teary eyes when she asks if they're fighting. Gwen Haley visits her husband in jail with some bad news from Tanya's doctor. The damage was so extensive that she'll never be able to have kids. Carl Lee says he keeps thinking of those boys when they fell, and that's the only thought that gives him any comfort. Gwen also says she is struggling to pay the bills, and it only gets worse and worse. So Carl Lee asks her to explain more about that collection Reverend A.G.'s been organizing for him. At Wilbanks, poor Ethel can't stand this anymore. She has to keep holding off all kinds of collectors, and now she's getting threats at home too. Right when she's saying he is obsessed with this case, a call from Sheriff Walls comes to alarm them both. Jake meets with Isaiah Street at the jail. He recognizes the famous defense lawyer, Norman Reinfeld, who's predictably smug and arrogant about his success rate. Mr. Street patronizingly explains the importance of the case and why they can't leave it in inexperienced hands. Jake is a bit disappointed to learn that Carl Lee has invited them, but he has no interest in getting a new lawyer. Reverend A.G. has collected $7,000 to pay Reinfeld, but he told the congregation they were donating money to the family, threatening to expose both reverends as manipulative, fame-thirsty bastards. Carl Lee demands that the money be split between Gwen and the lawyer of his choice. And that's still Jake. He celebrates that win with Harry. His friend is completely mesmerized by Ellen when she joins them, still uninvited. This time she's helping with the insanity plea. Taking from the success rate in past cases, it seems like the jury tends to decide based on which psychiatrist is more convincing or even likable. After Ellen leaves, Harry asks Jake why the hell he is still refusing the free help. He says he doesn't need Ellen because he's got him. Harry, who could totally ditch his extremely lucrative divorce cases to support a friend and work a case that matters for a change. Profoundly touched, Harry tells him he can go to hell. Tonight, Mickey Mouse strikes again. This time, it is Mrs. Walls, the sheriff's wife, who gets the call. Mickey says someone is going to die. A few minutes later, Winston tiptoes toward Jake's house with a suitcase, but Sheriff Walls jumps him right away, followed by our friend Hastings. Jake says the family is out. The suitcase is making a ticking sound and it's no false alarm. There is an actual bomb about to go off. Walls tries to force Winston to defuse it, but Jake has a more intuitive approach. He simply throws the thing as far as he can. After such a close call, Jake decides to send Carla and Hannah to stay with his in-laws for a while. Judge Noose invites Jake for a chat at his sumptuous home. He lets him know that he'll deny the request for a change of venue. He also takes the opportunity to say that Haley could be out in 20 years with a guilty plea. That would be convenient to everyone involved, but especially to a young lawyer who certainly doesn't want to be remembered by the wrong reasons. When it looks like things can't get any worse for Jake, Lucien is happy to introduce him to Billy T, the defense expert who also happens to be an alcoholic. Lucien guarantees he is amazing when sober and his license is still valid. That night, Ethel and her husband are attacked by the clan. They beat up the poor man and tell her next time will be worse. After a late night at Lucien's, Jake is ambushed by Ellen again and has no energy to repel her. During lunch, she is shocked to learn he supports the death penalty and storms out of the restaurant. Impressed by her passion, he finally decides to accept her into what can be called a teen now. Even Harry is finally persuaded and Lucien is back in his old office. It's time for jury selection. It takes the whole afternoon, and as expected, Carl Lee can't really find a peer of his. At the same time, the KKK is marching towards the courthouse in broad daylight. There's an ugly clash with the Free Carl Lee protesters and a Klansman is set on fire. Jake comes out to help the sheriff and gets hurt too. A while later, Freddy receives news about the fellow Klansman. He didn't make it. Someone says it's all over now, but Freddy is too fired up now to stop. He takes his boys on a town tour, tossing burning crosses around until they reach Jake's house and burn it to the ground. In the morning, Jake is still trying to salvage what he can. Harry tries to convince him to quit, but he says all of this would have been for nothing. With a heavy army presence in town, the KKK suddenly learns how to hold up a sign and shout like the other protesters, instead of using fire and baseball bats. And so the big trial begins. Billy Ray's mother is the DA's first witness, followed by Sheriff Walls. When Jake asks about the attack on Tonya, the judge cuts him short and tells the jury to disregard it all. This is not what's being tried today. The jurors have been ordered not to discuss the case under any circumstances. They take their very first opportunity to disobey that. The longer they remain in disagreement, the longer they'll be confined and away from their families. An informal survey reveals 4 undecided, 7 leaning towards guilty, and only 1 to not guilty. On the second day, Buckley calls Deputy Looney. He makes sure to stress all the harm caused to him for no reason at all. But then Carl Lee insists that Jake asks him a question. He asks Looney's opinion about Carl Lee's fate. He says what happened to him was an accident and Carl Lee is a hero. In his place, he would have done exactly the same. Now this is something Buckley was not expecting from his own witness. Outside the courtroom, Freddy is waiting for Jake with a rifle. It turns out he's a lousy shot, and it's the guard standing next to Jake who gets hit. At night, Ellen is driving home when Hastings makes her pull over. Two other men grab her and take her to Freddy. Beaten up and tied to a tree, she is left to be eaten by animals. But sometime later, our mousy friend arrives and cuts her loose. Ellen is missed in court, but they don't know what happened yet. Buckley and Jake get busy discrediting each other's psychiatrists until an officer comes to say there's an emergency phone call. Jake goes to Canton Memorial to visit her. He says he's sorry that all this happened, but she won't listen to that. She wants him to focus on the trial. In the middle of the night, Carla comes to see Jake. She has driven all the way from Gulfport in a storm because she wanted to say something in person. So he prepares to get his ass dumped, but it's the opposite. She's been watching the case and has come to realize she had been unfair to blame him. Deep down, she thought he was jeopardizing his family for fame and glory. Now she can see he really means all the stuff he's saying in court. After she leaves, Jake goes see Carl Lee in his cell. He shares his concerns about tomorrow. There's only summation left. He has to make the most of that last chance to convince the jury. Carl Lee says he picked Jake because he is just like those jurors. This is how they win the case. He may think he is a good guy and that he treats everyone the same, but is that really, really true? He needs to talk to the jury as if he were talking to himself, just this time being completely honest. In the courtroom, Buckley's summation is mostly centered in "thou shalt not kill" stuff, which is a bit cheeky when we remember he's asking for the gas chamber. Then it's Jake's turn to speak directly to the jury without annoying objections. He asks them to close their eyes and says he'll tell a story. Then he tells them what happened to Tonya Haley that day in every horrible detail. As the story ends, he can't hold back his tears anymore. Not because he is a father too, or because of the horror he just described, but because he knows what he'll say next. Before they open their eyes, he tells them to take a moment and imagine that story all over again. But this time, imagine that Tonya Haley is a white girl. The heavy silence outside is broken by a boy shouting the verdict, "Not guilty." Half of the crowd celebrates while the other half is pretty much being all arrested for what they've done to Ellen, including Deputy Hastings. And this is the end. This was a recap of the 1996 movie, A Time to Kill by Regency Enterprises, starring Samuel L. Jackson, Matthew McConaughey, and Sandra Bullock. So, what would be your vote in that jury? Let us know in the comments below with #CinemaRecap. Until next time.